this podcast, Venu Vasudevan from Procter & Gamble talks about his journey to creating a data science team. So, stay tuned. Welcome everyone to another episode of Future Data Podcast. Today we have with us Venu Vasudevan, who is a research director of data science and AI practice at Procter & Gamble, where he directs the data science and AI organization at P&G Research. He is a technology leader with a track record of successful consumer and enterprise innovations at the intersection of AI, machine learning, big data, and IoT. Previously, he was VP of Data Science at an IoT startup, a founding member of Motorola team that created Zigbee IoT standard, worked to create an industry-first zero-click interface for mobile with Dak Kitlos, who is a co-creator of Apple Siri, created an industry's first Google Glass experience for TV, an Aris video analytics and big data platform recently acquired by Comcast, and a social analytics platform leveraging Twitter that was featured in Wired magazine and BBC. Venu holds a PhD in database and AI from the Ohio State University and was a member of Motorola's Science Advisory Board. These are like top 2% of Motorola technologists. So pretty cool there. And he is an adjunct professor at Rice University's Electrical and Computer Engineering Department and was a mentor at Chicago's 1871 Startup Incubator. So Venu, with that, thank you so much and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Vishal. Thank you for inviting me and the generous introduction.
So this is, I think, all the relevant keywords stuck together. So I think you definitely have worked in some of these key areas. So why don't you walk us through your journey till now? We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
Certainly. So my career, you could think of it as a microcosm of the evolution of the data and AI boundary as it turns out. I started out as an electrical engineer because that was a way for somebody with an interest in physics to make money. But over time, I realized I had a taste for some of the softer side, the interdisciplinary side of things. That took me into computer science, which when I first got into, I thought was a mature field, but now I realize how young it was when I actually joined it. My PhD was in knowledge-based systems, which I think today would be called product lifecycle management. But part of my PhD was how do you embed AI in a digestible way into databases, and in a way that there's a benefit to the sort of end industry. In our case, the value prop was that if you embed expert systems into data, then it can validate or invalidate from a process perspective the data as it's being created. So my PhD was also contributed to a startup that was acquired by Parametric Technologies back then. Today, that's a very common thing for a PhD student to also work on a startup on the side. But back in the days when I was doing that, it was certainly a deviation from normal. Next, I sort of took those ideas and applied it to. I joined Motorola and applied it to a large, one of the largest chips in the semiconductor industry at that point. And at that point, I got the bug to do something that was a big story. And there was a project called Iridium that was just germinating at that point, which was this notion of 66 satellites that circumnavigated the globe and created sort of a cellular network. So I became the database and network management architect of Iridium, which not only had a lot of interesting data science problems, but gave you sort of brag-worthy experiences in, for example, using an SR-71 to test satellite. Wow. It was the only object that could move fast enough to simulate a satellite. But so that was, I would say, big data, even by today's standards. We were looking at about 1 million events a second coming from 66 satellites on every second. And part of the idea was, can you make sense through event aggregation and all the technologies that are now familiar? So that was sort of a great experience in terms of what does the biggest of the big look like in a data science context? But after that, given that that was the first wave of AI, I sort of went into a startup that was being funded by DARPA to look at intelligent agents for industrial applications and how they could tame semi and unstructured data. Spent some fun times there, but realized that maybe it was too early for AI to make an impact on the world. However, there was this thing called a mobile, which was a dull voice device at that point, but this might turn into a vehicle through which AI would ultimately manifest itself. So that took me prematurely, I would say maybe 6 or 7 years prematurely to Motorola, where I thought the whole community would see it was blindingly obvious that a mobile was a data device and that we could get on with innovating. But what I realized was that often as an innovator, you are well ahead of the industry. So part of what you need is a point of view, but part of what you need is patience. And it really took 7 years between when I joined and the advent of the iPhone that you really got that inflection point around mobile being sort of a data device. That said, so that period of time took me to when I wasn't solving big data problems, but I was solving untidy data ones. Things like how do you wade through a mass of user behavior to glean user context and attention? And what do you do with that user context and attention to create context-aware services for the end user, for instance? How do you deal with the fact that networks are not optimal and cache data upfront to create services that delight the user while dealing with the network as it is? I would call that period of time as a data scientist learning to create customer delight and bounded economics. The cost of what you built would be bounded, the bandwidth would be bounded, et cetera. And along the way there, we started looking not just at mobile as a data source and a data opportunity, but sensors, especially industrial sensors, as a data source and opportunity, which led a small team of us to invent Zigbee, which we didn't really think would be all the things it is today. But again, there's another example of where you create technology and you create user experiences, but the real impact in the world is when the economics get to a point where it all makes sense. So after that, the iPhone happened, and then the big data game was on. I think the industry as a whole saw the big data game was on. I think people talked about convergence of mobile, social, and media back in the early 90s, but it really took the advent of the iPhone for those words to actually come together in a way that had punch. At that point, the next few years, I spent time addressing how you could take social, which is evolving at the same time as mobile. What does social plus mobile plus media mean that makes media more participative, more engaging, especially sort of old style classic media such as TV? How do you make it more participative? I looked at that space, and I sort of more recently looked at how can machine learning and social combine to reformat TV. Let me sort of give you a flavor of what I mean there. TV content is getting to a point where it's high risk, low reward today. It costs $100 million to make Game of Thrones. And if you go ask any of these editors, what's happening on minute 31? Is that an interesting minute? And by the way, that costs $200,000-$300,000. They'll say, well, I don't really know. I created the story and I put it out there and hopefully it works.
Right.
But part of what we brought to the table was how do you use machine learning and what you're talking about, a petabyte a week worth of data. How do you take the combination and understand the stories within the stories? So we created some technology there that was ultimately acquired by Comcast. But it was an example, a very concrete example at scale that really gave me experience of untidy, large data sets with multiple potential stories you could tell around that, each with potentially a business model that needed to be invented. After that, having spent a bunch of time in large companies, I got the bug to go back to small companies, and I said, okay, this time IoT is really going to happen. Having tried it, in the Zigbee days, et cetera. It was a fun experience looking at how do you create another daily touch product around smart lighting. And I realized that as a technologist in data science, you are, especially if you're trying to reinvent industries, you have two counterbalancing weights. One is the potential for new technologies to reformat the problem. The other is the weight of legacy. So if you're reinventing a switch, it's great to reinvent a switch that works in a new house. But how do you get to reinvent a switch that works with 50-year-old electrical lighting and electrical structures and 70-year-old electricians who install them? So all that was a really engaging experience. Understood the positives and negatives of startup life again. But I think part of that sort of brought me back to Procter & Gamble saying, well, I think I've looked at inventing a new daily touch product, but I think what would be more interesting as a next chapter to my life is taking a company that already builds daily touch products that engage 4 billion users and saying, how do you redefine that product in the eyes of the user and in the eyes of how it sort of goes to market? So that's a microcosm of of my career in hopefully 5 minutes or thereabouts.
We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast. I think that's beautiful. And by the way, thank you so much for walking us through that. Let's talk about your so before we get into your nitty-gritties of your past, let's talk about your current role in P&G. Like what is that role, and if you can walk us through whatever you can share.
Yes, so P&G sort of has a long history of market-defining products, of marketing science and retail science. They invented a lot of those, as also sort of open innovation. A strong bench of statisticians. So what they were looking for was somebody with a blended background who could come in and help the company move from strong statistical capabilities to big data, which, as you know, tends to be interdisciplinary. So I direct an R&D group of data scientists with strong stats background, data engineers as well, to create business value around both the daily touch products, the razors, the soap, et cetera, things that we use on a daily basis. But behind these daily touch products is high performance science. There's chemistry, microbiology, material science that, as I think Steve Jobs used to say, easy is hard. So, behind every easy experience is actually a whole bunch of hard work that goes in. So, so really my team looks at big data problems around how do you create products? How do you connect the science models within them to what the consumer perception of the science model is going to be? Without necessarily building and launching those products. As also, how do you take our products, which are facilitating mundane daily activities, and sort of elevate the relationship between our product and the end user using big data, using consumer feedback, for instance.
Interesting. And thank you so much for walking us through that. So one thing that when you were explaining your background that sort of got me excited was your Zigbee days, right? So I think if you look at today, and this is, I get into this conversation a lot, standardization of technology, right? So now technology is sort of getting more convoluted and sort of more complicated. And then basically we have seen operating systems for now mobile devices, that's iOS and those things. We have seen operating system for our personal computers. And basically they created some common standards and everyone just jumped on it. They can build app on it and all that fun stuff. But IoT world is pretty sort of discrete. Like it's still very in its infancy stage. Everyone is coming up with their own sort of sweet flavor of what to do. Like what was your experience of from your Zigbee days of creating the standardization? Like what are some of the things that comes to your, like, that you have to think about in creating the standardization? And then looking at the trends now, what do you think are we going in the right track? Do you think we'll achieve a standardization sort of or basically some standards that we all can follow in building this IoT? Like would we have an IoT OS anytime soon? So what are your takeaways on that?
So a little bit of history. I think we created the Zigbee standard at an interesting time in the life of standards. If you look at standards before Zigbee, let's say before 2005-ish, standards were typically created and controlled by industries. They were very carefully created, carefully crafted with certain use cases, certain business models in mind. And I think the advent of software, sort of pervading through all industries, fundamentally changed how standards are created. I think standards today are much more developer driven, much more driven by a de facto app, and often driven by, a large company or two large companies that can create these things at scale. So even back in the days, it was the IETF, sort of the Internet Engineering Task Force, used to be much more of that semi-chaotic sort of world. And I think over the last 10, 12 years, we have seen the value of that semi-chaotic world, not worrying about mobilizing entire industries, but somebody takes the lead and sort of makes things happen. But I think Internet of Things makes me wonder if we need to go back to some of the more orderly approach to standards, because IoT is all about interoperability. It's not about the capability of any single superior device. It's about everything in the home working together. And I joke about this saying, if standards were not to develop in the smart home, then when a kid is born in 2025, you're going to baptize them. You're going to pick their, private school if you're in a certain mindset, and you're going to have to pick at that point: are you going to be an Apple, Amazon, or Google household? Because once you make this, you're going to get stuck with it. But I'm hoping that standards, that we create some standards over the next 10, 15 years, so we bring back open competition, because we're rapidly getting to that point where the user experience, if you really want a credible user experience in the home, you pretty much have to pick a vendor and go with what they bring to the table.
Right. No, I think spot on. Like I was having a conversation with Ford's chief data officer a couple of weeks back, and he had the same concerns. Right. So they're saying that right now, like, we are more dependent on sensors, and it's more, as you rightly pointed out, it's the interoperability that's the secret sauce now. If they don't interoperate, then it's like, you're absolutely right. You have to be baptized Apple or whatever, right? And it just makes it less powerful for everyone, and then we get into this. So yeah, I think, thank you for sharing your point of view on that. Now let's talk about the AI. Like, so when I was couple of years back practicing AI, it's ridiculous. Like it's buggy. It's useless piece of technology. It's very high error rates. What do you think? What's your perspective? How AI has evolved from couple of maybe decades back to now? Like what's your take on that? We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
So I guess I've seen multiple of these chapters of technology come and revolutionize, the way we live. I have two opposing forces in me. One is the skeptic who has seen bubbles that are too good to be true, prove out to be too good to be true. But there are other cases like Web 2.0 where I underestimated the impact it would have, or camera phones and the extent to which they changed. They made all of us visual beings, and citizen journalism, for instance, where I underestimated the extent to which it impacted us. And so when I see the sort of Cambrian explosion of innovation in AI, those two forces in me sort of debate each other. But my view is, over the last couple of years, I've become a believer, partly because I think the sort of innovation in AI today is actually fueled by theories that were created 20, 25 years ago. And in fact, those were theories that were discredited at that point because they just didn't have enough data to validate that they could operate. And they needed data to sort of appear at that scale. That said, so I think that is my view from a performance point of view, that deep learning is actually redefining not only what you can do with data, it's redefining what machine learning means, and it's actually upending certain techniques that were very popular right before it. Clearly, from a societal perspective, the big concern is the tension between performance and explainability. And I think in a lot of domains that I think still hasn't played out, and hopefully it plays out in a way that is positive, for society.
Your current role in PNG, so when they sort of brought you on board, and if you look at a company like a CPG company, and with an umbrella brand and all that, and How do you envision yourself in that role? Like, what are some of the things that comes to your mind when you evaluate running a data science and AI practice for a wide CPG company? Like, what are some of the thoughts?
I think I think of a practice as, first of all, if you think of the world outside in, what are the categories of problems you're trying to solve? What are the untidy crevices, within that categories? And what kinds of disciplines, either upskilling the people you already have, or, what kind of new people, would you bring that would allow you to, formulate the problem in a way that is, progressively solvable, the whole sort of lean innovation mindset. So that's how I look at it. From coming from not a hard science background or a computer science background, I would say, I probably have a short attention span. I don't solve problem in 10-year horizons. I solve problem in 3-year horizons with sort of 6-month checkpoints on, how are you doing, so to speak, right? So that's how I look at it from the point of view of talent. I think most of us start with a base of people who have a certain skill set. And so we're really looking at not growing a team from sort of immaculate conception, so to speak, but how do you grow a bench, in directions you want to go. So from that perspective, I'd say it's a combination of adapt, adopt, and evolve. And I've grown data science teams who were strong in engineering. I've grown data science teams now who are strong in statistics. So they each come with a certain rootedness where they're good. And then the common part of growing a team, I think, is establishing a data culture, which is, listen to the stories the data can tell. Don't fall in love with the data you have, because maybe the data you have isn't where the story is. Maybe the data you don't have that you need to collect is where the story is. And then have a clear sense of what is the claimable benefit you can extract from the data sets. You need to have a sense of, not just can I do better than now, but can I do better than whatever I'm doing now that will actually make a difference from a business perspective. And finally, I think I really preach that you need to be interdisciplinary to a fault, because real problems don't care about what discipline you come from. They are what they are.
That's interesting. No, I think well said. So on that note, like what has been your journey difference when it comes to startup vis-a-vis a company with a transnational corporation? Like what are some of the stark differences that you have seen as a practitioner to build a data science and AI practice? What are some of the thoughts there?
So typically in a startup, you're solving one problem at a time, and you're going narrow and deep, and you're going at 100 miles an hour. So you define the problem, and you're operating at the low end of scale, so to speak. You're just looking for a problem that takes you from nascence to one level of maturity. So on the one hand, you may have a clarity to what the problem statement is, because that's how you work one problem at a time. The flip side is you're not necessarily looking on day one to impact the world at scale. I think running a data science organization in a large company is more of a portfolio process. It's understanding, the different areas where there's enough clarity that you can go solve a problem, and at the same time thinking about, as you build a portfolio, thinking about leverage, which is, if I solve this problem, how many other business categories is it likely to have sort of an effect on? So I spend a lot more time triaging, selecting problems that could have multiplicative benefit, as also sort of balancing the risk reward of different things the team works on.
Interesting. And I think one thing that also we see a lot is the bias problem that's right now sort of getting into the data science practice. Like a couple of years back, IT was a new phenomena. People were sort of investing into this IT get into the DNA of corporate DNA. And now IT is one of the fundamental building block of a corporation. Now data science is following the same trajectory. Now, many of the data scientists or chief data officers, they are part of now board of advisory as well, for the same reason that it's a critical component now. And this field is disrupting. Like this field is there are a lot of new things emerging, a lot of sort of old thing getting obsolete pretty quickly. So in this scenario, businesses are relying more and more on individuals who are actually carrying that baton within a company to execute this practice. The bias problems creeps in, right? So if I know this is the best, how am I ensured that what I know is the best? So what are some of your thoughts around that idea of the bias in this data science industry?
I think one way to combat bias is not to be too internally focused, as a company or as a group. So one of the things I push is, compete with the best and always be aware of the best, because I would say each company probably has an internal bias within it. No matter how great a company, you are shaped more by your successes. You are shaped by your success and failures, and they sort of sit, more prominently in your mind than anything else. One of the things I like to say is, whatever made you successful is probably what's going to, make you fail. That's just the nature. That's just the nature of things, and in a way, that's good, because that allows new companies and new ideas to sort of come into the mix. So I would say the single most important thing is be aware of what's happening externally, and treat a technique that your competitor is using or an adjacent industry is using, especially an adjacent industry that is ultimately likely to come into your space, is likely to be using a different technique than you. And having been sort of in the Motorola, Nokia world, and seeing how we didn't disrupt each other, actually Apple disrupted us because we came in and applied a different set of rules. So I'm very cognizant about that. That idea of a wide-angle vision reduces bias.
Interesting. No, I think, yeah, absolutely. So one story that I recall, like I was talking to one of the product manager of BlackBerry, and he said that since we were hitting our targets, we were hitting all of our goals, we were sort of growing at the pace that we were growing and all that, suddenly the landscape shifted itself. So the parameter that we were monitoring were not they became one of the industry's core parameters, and the parameter that we were actually monitoring and killing it, no one cared about that eventually. So with that, I think you raise an interesting point of having a wider scope or a wider lens of the problem, because then you can surface these microcosms, like these micro ecosystem that emerging, to keep a tap on that. Now, if you talk about, say, and you said internally focused, staying more out, not too internally focused. So on that concept, culture comes to my mind, right? So when you join a bigger company, culture is one of the core fundamental block, or sort of, whether it's an opportunity, whether it's a weakness, however you want to take it. Like now, as a practitioner, to take these new concepts of data science and AI, if you hit, and you have hit with companies which are very core culture focused, you have worked with very beautiful companies who are innovating and still have maintaining their core culture. What are some of the success or best practices that you can share that has helped you stay successful while working with these companies?
Yeah, I think one of the things to consider, especially with companies that have a history and have a culture, is not to view culture as an anachronism, but actually to view it as a signature of past success. For example, when I was in Motorola, it was very common for people to look at problems from the point of view of antenna design or voice or radio frequency. And that was because a lot of Motorola successes came out of that space. So you should take it for what it is. It brings a certain strength, typically, the revenue base. You should not take it as something you're going to be able to change overnight. It's a reality you're going to have to work with. But I think then you have to have the tenacity to gradually build credibility. Again, going back to the Motorola example, it took 4 or 5 or 7 years for the company and the industry to realize that mobile data was a huge opportunity. And part of what I think, if you're going to be an entrepreneur, you certainly want sort of clarity and honesty in framing a question, so that people who are not necessarily from your domain can understand it. But the other part is tenacity. An idea in these spaces may take months or years, even in some cases. And success actually comes just when you're ready to give up. Because people who are not necessarily in your domain need to hear an idea articulated 2 or 3 or 4 times. They need to see those small successes. And then the sort of wheels begin to turn. And when you do succeed, there's a great deal of gratification, because it was not simply because you were smart or your idea was clever, but you sort of rode that long race and sort of won it at the end, if you will.
Interesting. Uh, Beautiful point, by the way. I think when you were saying that, one thing that came to my mind, and that's true from your academic background, and we hear it a lot from academics who are still involved with sort of learning and like understanding what's going on, and the thought of, say, all the mathematical models, all the core concepts, when they were involved or when they were invented. Um, at that point there was not too much data, like there was, the number sets were not that too heavy and all that, so the error bar concept was not anyone's worry, right? But now, sort of, now we're dealing with data that we have never dealt with before, and I think so. One professor actually, he put it best. He said that the entire framework of mathematics needs to be revisited, considering the amount of data that we are relying on, because otherwise there will be like a lot of black swan opportunities that could emerge, because our models are not prepped and prepared for these sort of ginormous data sets. So what are some of your thoughts on that phenomena? Like what's your take on that?
That's a really interesting debate, because all of a sudden theoreticians have gone from glory to despair over the last 2 or 3 years.
Right.
With used to be in a computer vision conference, your program committee was all people who developed algorithms, and now all of a sudden, all people care about is, well, how many GPUs did you use for your relatively straightforward algorithm to run and do things in ways that and I think this is, to me, this is part of the growth of every industry. You start with the practitioners grabbing on to opportunity where, without necessarily analyzing it, that it's almost like a startup where you say you have a bunch of teenagers who just use the technology to create as much leverage as possible. And then over time, the principles, which can't evolve at the speed at which, empirical experiments can, sort of come to place. I believe theory and having theoretical foundations is going to be super important, even in deep learning. But I think it's still refreshing to see the extent to which a new technique can create sort of so much debate, so much impact in a short period of time.
Interesting, and yeah, I think, thank you so much for sharing your point of view on that. I think two books comes to my mind when I think about like culture, the idea of culture, and then idea of something as cutting edge as data science and AI. So innovator's dilemma, right? So they talk about sustainable innovation vis-a-vis disruption. So they say hey, sustainable is whatever we are operating now, and disruption is what probably you can work on the future. And the other is, I think it's called power of now. And they talk about an interesting perspective. So they say, hey, humans have a tendency to reconcile past to present. Like our entire corporate culture is built around past to present. What have you done last year is what probably I'll evaluate how you did something, and then probably I'll think of from that scale what your capability in the future is. And he said the problem is when you are having too much disruptions going on, reconciling present to the future is all the more important, right? Because now the idea is it's like you pointed out a couple of minutes back that you probably won't exist if you don't cope up with this. With what's happening around in the future. How do you reconcile between these two sort of these two worlds, like understanding culture, appreciating that, and then dragging it into the future, or maybe dragging is not the right word, but vis-a-vis of disruption, like totally radical shiny object that you have a tendency to, and you pointed out beautifully that right now we're talking about GPUs, and we're just not focusing that much into the model that actually these GPUs used, which could not sustain those GPUs. So how do you reconcile between these two sort of school of thinkings?
I think, as I've seen, over the years, the extent to which the web disrupted much more complicated technologies, and camera phones disrupted regular phones, I have developed a great deal of respect for the awesome power of simplicity. And I think it's typically simplicity is disruptive. So I look for markets where simplicity is coming in. And instead of poo-pooing it as lack of sophistication, I see it as probably the front end of a disruption. And so in a large corporation, can you articulate that simplicity to people who are skeptical and really make them understand through a combination of history and the extent to which it's versatile that certain forms of simplicity are actually just people experimenting with ideas that are not great, but certain forms of simplicity are actually the front end, of disruption. So from a culture point of view, that it's really, I think, part of our job as being in a new discipline is being able to articulate that same message in the domain vocabulary of all the people who created the previous successes for the company. And so in each company, that answer of how you do that is specific to the culture of the company. It is specific to what the incumbent domains are that are driving, driving the product. And so data scientists, that's why I feel like data scientists have to be interdisciplinary, because part of your job is coming up with, interesting ways of using technologies. But part of your job is having that engagement, that conversation with a variety of chemists, microbiologists, material scientists, who are going to be, adopters of your ideas, who are going to be collaborators with whom you had to co-innovate. So understanding, having that credibility in being able to speak to them in their domain vocabulary is kind of a key to success.
Interesting. I think beautifully said. Thank you for sharing your point of view on that. So let's talk about an hypothetical. So if suppose you are asked to run a data science group, and for a large corporation with transnational focus, what are some of the things that comes to your mind? Like, how do you end up? What are some of the practices or some of the things what are 3 to 4 things that will come to your mind, and how will you sort of get started in that journey?
Yeah, if you're hiring from scratch, the first 2 or 3 or 4 people you hire are very, very critical, because they pretty much determine the trajectory of the organization. I think I've been asked this question before, which is, who do you want to hire first? What kind of person?
Yeah.
And I think, again, back to my passion about interdisciplinary, you want somebody with a core that's of solving really hard problems, but having that interdisciplinary. And I think I'm probably not terribly original in saying, ideally, you want a polymath physicist. The physics part of it solve things at scales, that the rest of us are still sort of grappling with. And the polymath aspect says they respect, they have enough of a knowledge of other disciplines. The other thing I look for is, if I were to, find this foundational member, is behaviorally a second order thinker. There's a hedge fund manager, Howard Marks, who said, there are a lot of first order thinkers in the stock market. The question is, do you have a second order thinker who can think about what the world would look like if all the first order thinkers thought a certain way, right? And I think in our market, part of what hits us is we all can grapple with linear thinking. It's the nonlinearity we never accounted for that, typically comes and gets you. It wasn't even on your competitive landscape. So I look for those, but beyond that, I think in our space, it's a very pragmatic space. You have to be a programmer. Even if you're a manager, you have to be a programmer, because the gap between good and great is a great deal of craft. And you need to be enough of a practitioner to recognize good craft sort of from bad.
Interesting. So I think when you were talking, that one thing that comes to my mind is data science as an art of doing business or as a science of doing business. I think I speak that a lot in the podcast and take perspectives that in doing business, either you need an art of doing business and you need a science of doing business. Business folks, they are the artists, right? They figure out how and all that. And IT and database, and they are pretty much the science side of things. And now with AI and all, and increasing reliance on data science, the line is getting smudgier. Like, so sometimes even the tech nerds are taking into the role of arts, and artists saying, okay, I can code too, maybe, and they take the role of science. What are your thoughts on on this this phenomena? Like, how do as a data science practice, and you said some of the good things that communicating and people who can communicate, they can help fix this gap. But what is your thinking of how we can create an organization in which data science actually is empowering both of this vertical equally, and which do you have a preference on, science vis-a-vis art, or what's your take on that?
I think the world of sort of massively online courses and MOOCs has certainly democratized, who can turn into a data scientist. And theoretically, if you have the willpower, you maybe you don't even need a degree. You can take a bunch of MOOCs. You can go to Kaggle competitions, and you can learn everything empirically. And I think I respect that as a show of willpower. But typically, I feel when I hire people, I'm making a 5, 7, 10-year investment in them. So I still expect that you have to have a principled background in some space to really thrive in this space with all the twists and turns it's going to take over the next few years. I do believe that I think articulating your data story is a core skill that everybody has to have, and I think it's probably in our world where we are looking for a return on investment for our education, it's probably somewhat underemphasized. If I were the dean of an engineering school or a computer science school, I'd probably increase the amount of liberal arts that is mandated as part of the core curriculum. Not only because it allows you to be a better storyteller, but I think over time, as data science clashes with privacy, with ethics, depending on robotics, etc., having at least a peripheral understanding of the ways in which data science impacts society would be important to make you more effective as a data scientist.
Interesting. And I think you put up best that you should be able to articulate your data science story. Like now, as a data science nerd, right? So, or with a very heavy tech accent, I don't know what I'm like. What are some of your thoughts on how can someone improve their storytelling? And I think you pointed out the liberal arts. I don't know, but what are some of the hacks? If I'm a practitioner right now, and I can talk in bits and maybe nibs. Like, what are some of your thoughts on how I can improve my storytelling capabilities? Do you have some pointers on that?
I personally think the best way to improve your storytelling is to look for a storyteller who fits your style. So, I mean, the classic examples are look at, Steve Jobs' first speech when he unveiled the iPhone, and, how somebody's able to tell a story with just white and black, which, compels you beyond anybody else. Or Guy Kawasaki has written certainly books about that, which appeal to my minimalist, minimalist about how I tell stories. I think the other thing I would recommend is YouTube and SlideShare and so on have a lot of examples of pitches from startups that ended up becoming $100 billion companies, right? And many of those pitches have a level of, they tell the story in a very compelling way. If you go back and look at that story now, you can see why those guys became $100 billion companies, because the story was very simple. So I think a lot of this simplicity and focusing on key elements and guiding your listener through the key transitions in your story, understanding what your audience is. I think these are learnable skills. It's just that you need to consider these important enough and invest in it.
Interesting. And so I think let's talk about your journey. So what are some of the like consistent challenges that you have seen throughout your journey that you're surprised to see? That what are some of the things that you say, like, I should not see this more often, but you ended up seeing those? Do you have any take on those?
I think the consistent challenges are that being an innovator is something we all want to be, but if you're thinking differently, it takes much longer for you to actually have an impact, and you just have to accept that. You also have to accept, and it certainly took me a while, that the journey is a good part of the reward. So you have to enjoy that part of taking a point of view that maybe not everyone maybe not everyone sees it, and the fact that you have that point of view is what makes you tick. I think the other thing is you have to be willing to accept that if you have an unusual point of view, your failure rate is going to be higher. That you want to try multiple of these ideas. As I think Thomas Edison said, one of the things that makes me more successful is I fail much more quickly than the other guy.
Interesting. Wow. No, I think that's a good point. And what are as per you, what is the tenet of a good data scientist? Like what is that one or what are the ingredients of a good data scientist or data science guy that you would aspire to recruit or aspire to work with?
Yeah, I think that varies a little bit depending on the particular data science discipline. But if we consider that data scientists 5-10 years ago were probably in the marketing and retail science side of things, where the data was already there, and presumably somebody else collected it in a lake, and your job was really to sort of create that insight out of data with some combination of science and visualization and storytelling. But I think increasingly, as we're moving to an Internet of Things kind of world where data doesn't necessarily come to you, you have to be inventive enough to go get it, clean it, curate it, or even create new devices to collect new kinds of data sets to complete your story. I think being a tenacious programmer cannot be overemphasized. I think the line between a very principled data scientist and a programmer are definitely blurring. So you have to be that polymath that covers both of those. I think the other thing is you have to have an understanding of the domain beneath the data. How was this data collected? What is the provenance of it? What does it mean to the customer, of the data? So really spending a lot of, if you're dealing with chemists or dealing with material scientists or dealing with biologists, really understanding, the domain beneath the data is super important. And I think the third thing is, depending on the business you're trying to impact, having a business model understanding of what are the benefit spaces, what is the so what, behind the data? What does success look like? And how rigorous does success need to be in this business discipline for it to move the needle in terms of business value? And each business in that sense is, insurance may have a different level of rigor than retail, which may have a different level of rigor than, movie recommender systems. So having that clarity of how good does my conclusion need to be to be of business benefit? I think those are things. You could argue that a data scientist is purely technical, but I think to be successful, you want to be kind of this full service entrepreneur who does one or two of them really well, but you have to be great at one or two of these things and good at the others.
Interesting. And if we talk about, say, in your past teams that you have worked with, like what is the one thing that you would say that businesses could improve when it comes to hiring for someone in data science? Like what are some of the things that you could say, hey, probably they could have done a better job if they would have done X, Y, or whatever, like if it's a one thing or an X things. Do you have any take on that?
So one of my favorite books about hiring that I read because the title was so ridiculous was called 11 and a Half Weird Ideas That Work. It's by Robert Sutton, who's a professor at Stanford, who had chapters that were named something like hire a person that you don't need or hire a person that you don't like. And I guess it was a very influential book to some extent on me because it made me understand that diversity of thought in your team is very important, so that you always have a representation not only of sort of the areas that you think are important, but potentially the areas that you need representation in. Your idea needs to be challenged in multiple different ways for it to emerge strong. So I would say, yeah, certainly based on the teams I have recruited that have performed well, it is the ability to innovate vertically, the ability to have lots of different opinions that are articulated well, gives those checks and balances that makes your end idea original, it makes it fresh, it makes it minimal, it makes it effective.
Interesting. Now let's talk about your journey, like what are some of the ingredients of your success so far? Like what do you say, like some of the traits that has helped you be what you are today?
I think that's a difficult one. I think one is over time you have a clear sense of what you're good at and what you're not good at, and you just get more honest about it because you've tried it multiple times. I would say most of the things that I found gratifying in hindsight were things that seemed uncomfortable in foresight. So I think one of the things I would encourage people is if you're not uncomfortable, you're not growing. But at the same time, when you're uncomfortable about an idea, it seems a little risky. You're also at the top of your game because you know that if you're not paying attention, you're definitely not, definitely gonna fail. As I think Larry Page once said, the safest thing to do is to take risk, and the riskiest thing to do is to play safe.
Right.
Other than that, yeah, I would say having a clarity of what my strengths are, sort of surrounding myself with people who complement that, tends to be. It's. I think we're in a people business. If you hire the right sort of people, and you have a culture where people want to succeed and they're willing to honestly state the problem, and they don't view failure as something you hide. You just view failure as part of the journey towards success.
Interesting.
That is much of what makes a team successful in data science or outside of data science, for that matter.
Interesting. And now let's talk about what are do you think some of the KPIs? If you are leading a data science and AI practice, what are some of the KPIs that you should be worrying about or that you should monitor?
So that's an interesting question in sort of my context, because often I was looking at new products, new markets, where part of defining the technology opportunity was also defining what success would mean. So the KPIs didn't exactly exist. So I'll give you an example. The work we did with, I guess I might have to stop there with the answer to that one.
Okay, and interesting. So let's talk about your favorite read. Do you have if you want to share with our audience if you have any favorite read that you want to share?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. As I was talking to you right before this conversation started, I just relocated to a new city, which means some of my old favorite books were sort of brought back to my consciousness in the process of boxing and unboxing. So I would say two of my favorite reads in that context, old favorites, if you will, were there's a biography of Isaac Newton. It's called Isaac Newton, The Last Sorcerer. What it sort of exposes you to is not only was he a great physicist, he was one of the preeminent polymaths who, by the way, invented a good chunk of astronomy as he went by. And I feel like polymaths are somewhat in short supply in the world today, and needed, especially as we look forward. The other book that back to our dialogue about theoreticians is a book called Against the Gods: The Remarkable Story of Risk, which was how theoreticians back in the 15th and 16th century, people invented probability for very, very pragmatic reasons around inventing insurance and inventing, helping nobles gamble. It just takes us back to a time when theoreticians were revered because they solved problems in the real world, and I think that's that's something to keep in mind in a world where we are getting so segmented and so hyper specialized that we have all these boundaries we're creating between theory and practice, between different disciplines, where maybe the real value over time is and on the boundaries between these disciplines.
Interesting. No, I think thank you so much, Venu. I think this was really, really remarkable. So before we part ways, love to know, do you have any closing remark for our viewers?
Yeah, and I would say the last 2 or 3 decades have been great for computer science, but I think the next 2 or 3 are going to, I would say, bring profound technology changes even compared to the last 2, whether it's in data, AI, robotics, all the things we're involved in are going to be important pillars. So I think we as a community and as people have an elevated responsibility. One is to stay young, stay foolish, as Steve Jobs would put it, always be learning and articulating the positive change that technology can bring, especially to society at large, and having sort of an empathy with people who are affected by the change, but nevertheless really in charge to create sort of a new and exciting future.
I think beautiful report. And with that, thank you so much, Venu, for gracefully agreeing to sit with us and share your wisdom candidly with our community. It was beautiful. Thank you so much, and we are always welcome back on the show to share your journey, and wish you nothing but luck with your current role, and hope to catch up with you in your future about your journey.
Thank you for the opportunity, Vishal. I hope your listeners enjoy this.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. I thought I was sick of home, but actually I was homesick. Never really knew that I would have to grow up so quick. I'm so uncomfortable, don't know anybody here. Just a couple dudes that I met once, that's it. And I go into the booth feeling nervous. Got butterflies in my stomach like I'm so worthless. Is the mic on? I don't know how to work this. Inside I'm breaking down, I hope I'm not up on a